April 30th, 1945, 2:30 p.m. The Reichstag, Berlin. A Soviet soldier named Meleton Kantaria climbed through smoke and rubble to plant the red banner atop the German parliament. Beside him, another soldier, Mikhail Yegorov, gripped the flagpole. The moment was captured by photographer Yevgeny Kaldey, who had arrived hours after the actual event, staging the shot for maximum propaganda impact. But within 18 months, one of those soldiers would vanish from Soviet records entirely, his image airbrushed from history, while American intelligence services would transform him into something neither side intended, a symbol of everything wrong with totalitarian image-making, and paradoxically, a tool for Western psychological warfare. The soldier who disappeared was Abdul Hakim Ismailov, a Dagestani Muslim whose presence in the iconic photograph contradicted Stalin's preferred narrative of Slavic triumph. The soldier who remained, Kantaria, became a hero of the Soviet Union. And the soldier who never existed in the frame but appeared in American propaganda leaflets by 1947 was a composite fiction, designed to expose Soviet manipulation while perpetrating its own. What began as documentary photography became a cascade of competing fabrications, each layer revealing how Cold War powers weaponized truth itself. To understand how a single image became a battlefield, you have to go back to the mechanics of wartime propaganda and the institutional structures that governed visual truth in both Moscow and Washington. By 1945, the Soviet Information Bureau operated under strict protocols. Every photograph released to domestic or international audiences required approval from multiple censorship layers, including the main political directorate of the Red Army and the Agitprop department of the Central Committee. Images weren't merely selected, they were constructed. Kaldey's Reichstag photograph underwent immediate alteration before publication in Ogonyok magazine on May 13, 1945. Smoke was added for drama. A second wristwatch on one soldier's arm, suggesting looting, was removed. The soldiers' identities were initially misreported, then corrected, then selectively emphasized based on ethnic and political considerations. The American apparatus mirrored this structure with different vocabulary, but identical function. The Office of War Information, succeeded in 1945 by the Interim International Information Service, and then the Office of International Information and Cultural Affairs, operated psychological warfare units tasked with analyzing and countering Soviet propaganda. By 1947, these units fell under the newly created Central Intelligence Agency, which inherited OSS expertise in black propaganda, material falsely attributed to enemy sources. The Reichstag photograph, already manipulated by Soviet censors, became raw material for American counter-manipulation. Meleton Kantaria was born in 1920 in the Georgian village of Javari. A metalworker before conscription, he joined the Red Army in 1940 and served in the 756th Rifle Regiment of the 150th Rifle Division. His selection to plant the victory banner was not random, it was curated. Soviet command chose representatives from different Soviet republics to symbolize multinational unity, but the emphasis tilted heavily toward Slavic and Georgian soldiers, reflecting Stalin's own Georgian heritage and the regime's hierarchical ethnic preferences. Kantaria's Georgian identity was acceptable. Ismailov's Muslim Dagestani background was not. Mikhail Yegorov, born 1923 in the Russian village of Smolensk Oblast, was a sergeant in the same regiment. His Russian ethnicity made him the ideal co-hero in Soviet narratives. Both men were photographed together, awarded medals, paraded in victory celebrations. But the third man, Ismailov, who had actually been part of the banner-raising group and appeared in early photographs, was systematically erased. His face was retouched out. His name disappeared from official accounts. Soviet records credited only Kantaria and Yegorov, a sanitized version that fit ideological requirements. American intelligence obtained the original, unretouched Reichstag photographs through multiple channels, captured German archives, defectors, and Western journalists who had received early Soviet press releases before the censorship apparatus fully tightened. By late 1946, analysts at the Strategic Services Unit, the CIA's predecessor, were comparing versions of the Reichstag image, documenting discrepancies. The discovery of Ismailov's removal provided a perfect propaganda opportunity, proof that the Soviet Union falsified its own history, that its heroic narratives were lies, that even its greatest triumph was a fabrication. But the American response wasn't to restore Ismailov or tell his story. It was to fabricate further. In early 1947, CIA psychological warfare specialists began producing leaflets for distribution in Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe and border regions of the USSR itself. These leaflets featured the Reichstag photograph with captions in Russian, Ukrainian, and German, claiming that the soldier planting the flag was not Kantaria, but a Ukrainian nationalist who had been executed by the NKVD immediately after the photograph was taken. The leaflet text read, "They used him for the picture, then erased him from life." This is how Moscow treats its heroes. The story was entirely invented. No such Ukrainian soldier existed. The operation's purpose was not truth, but destabilization, to sow distrust in Soviet veterans, to suggest that heroism under communism led to betrayal. Other versions of the leaflet claimed the soldier was a Jew, purged during Stalin's post-war anti-Semitic campaigns. Another variant suggested he was a Baltic conscript, shot for attempting to defect. Each version targeted specific ethnic or regional audiences, exploiting known Soviet purges and ethnic tensions. The common thread was the message: your government lies, your sacrifices are forgotten, your heroes are murdered. The Reichstag photograph, already a lie, became a scaffold for competing lies. The operational mechanism was straightforward. CIA officers working under diplomatic cover in Western Europe coordinated with émigré groups, Ukrainian nationalists, Baltic independence movements, anti-communist Russian organizations to distribute the leaflets. Some were airdropped via balloon over Soviet territory, a technique refined during the Korean War. Others were smuggled across borders by agents or inserted into care packages sent to relatives in the USSR. The leaflets were designed to look like samizdat, underground dissident publications, with intentionally crude printing to suggest grassroots origin rather than foreign intelligence production. Soviet counterintelligence detected the operation by mid-1947. KGB archives, partially declassified in the 1990s, show that the Second Chief Directorate, responsible for internal security, identified the leaflets as American disinformation and launched investigations to trace distribution networks. Several couriers were arrested. Some were genuine dissidents who believed the leaflet's content. Others were unwitting participants. The KGB's response was to double down on the Kantaria-Yegorov narrative, producing documentary films, school textbooks, and museum exhibits that reinforced the official story while ignoring Ismailov entirely. The irony compounded. The Soviets had lied by omission, erasing Ismailov. The Americans lied by invention, creating fictional soldiers. Both sides used the same photograph to argue that the other was uniquely dishonest, while neither cared about the actual men who had climbed the Reichstag's ruins. Abdul Hakim Ismailov, the erased soldier, survived the war and returned to Dagestan. He worked as a collective farm administrator, lived quietly, and died in 2010 at age 87. For decades, he told neighbors and family that he had been part of the banner raising, but official Soviet histories never acknowledged him. It wasn't until 1996, after the Soviet Union's collapse, that Russian journalists investigating the Reichstag photograph's history tracked him down and confirmed his presence in the original, unretouched images. By then, he was 73, and the propaganda wars that had erased him were historical footnotes. Kantaria and Yegorov, the official heroes, received state pensions, medals, and ceremonial roles in Soviet commemorations. Kantaria died in 1993, Yegorov in 1975. Both were buried with military honors. Neither ever publicly acknowledged Ismailov's role, whether out of ignorance, complicity, or self-preservation. The Soviet state had chosen them, and they accepted the choice. The American leaflet operation continued sporadically until 1953, when Stalin's death and the subsequent thaw reduced its perceived utility. CIA assessments, declassified in 2003 under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, concluded that the leaflets had marginal impact on Soviet morale, but significant value in demonstrating Western commitment to psychological warfare. The operation's success was measured not by belief in the fabricated stories, but by the mere fact of distribution, proof that American intelligence could penetrate Soviet information space. What the operation revealed, inadvertently, was the structural symmetry between Cold War adversaries. Both sides operated under the assumption that images were instruments, not records. Both employed teams of retouchers, censors, and propagandists who understood that the camera could lie as effectively as the pen. Both prioritized narrative control over factual accuracy, and both justified deception as necessary for ideological survival. The Reichstag photograph itself became a symbol of this symmetry. In Soviet iconography, it represented victory over fascism and the superiority of the socialist system. In American psychological warfare, it represented Soviet dishonesty and the emptiness of communist heroism. Neither interpretation acknowledged the photograph's actual content. 3 exhausted soldiers, one of whom would be erased, performing a ritual act in a destroyed city, their individual lives subordinated to state purposes they had no power to resist. The question that remains is not whether the photograph was manipulated. It was by both sides. But what that manipulation reveals about the Cold War's epistemological battlefield. The image was never about Kantaria, Yegorov, or Ismailov as individuals. It was about the power to define reality, to decide which faces appeared in history and which vanished, to transform human beings into symbols and symbols into weapons. By the 1950s, the Reichstag photograph had become a case study in intelligence training programs on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Soviet officers learned how to detect Western forgeries and disinformation. American officers studied it as an example of successful propaganda exploitation. The photograph appeared in classified manuals, stripped of its human context, reduced to a tactical lesson. Control the image, control the narrative. But the image's power outlasted its propaganda utility. In post-Soviet Russia, the Reichstag photograph remains a cornerstone of Victory Day commemorations, displayed on billboards, projected onto buildings, printed on flags. The official narrative still credits Kantaria and Yegorov, though Ismailov's name now appears in some historical accounts, a grudging acknowledgement decades too late. In the West, the photograph is taught in media literacy courses as an example of wartime manipulation, often without mentioning the American fabrications it inspired. The deeper lesson is about the mechanics of symbolic warfare. The Reichstag photograph succeeded as propaganda not because it was true or false, but because it was specific enough to feel real and ambiguous enough to be reinterpreted. The soldiers' faces were visible but not famous, their identities malleable. The setting was iconic. The Reichstag, the swastika-topped building, the smoke of conquest, but the details were negotiable. Who planted the flag? When? Why? Each side answered differently, and each answer served a purpose beyond documentation. This is how a Soviet soldier became the symbol of American propaganda, not through defection or conversion, but through appropriation. The Americans didn't need Kantaria or Yegorov or Izmailov to believe in Western democracy. They needed the image of Soviet heroism to be destabilized, the myth of Soviet truth to be fractured. The soldier in the photograph, whoever he was, became a ghost in the machine of psychological warfare, his identity less important than his utility. The operation's architects understood something fundamental about Cold War competition. The battle wasn't only over territory, weapons, or alliances. It was over the authority to narrate reality. Whoever controlled the story of the Reichstag photograph controlled a piece of the war's meaning. The Soviets controlled it by curation, selecting heroes and erasing inconvenient participants. The Americans controlled it by subversion, injecting doubt and fabricating martyrs. Both strategies assumed that truth was a resource to be managed, not a principle to be honored. Declassified CIA documents from the 1970s, released under FOIA requests, show that the agency continued to monitor Soviet use of the Reichstag photograph for decades, tracking its appearances in films, textbooks, and exhibitions. Analysts noted shifts in how the image was presented, more emphasis on multinational unity in the 1960s, more focus on Russian leadership in the 1970s, and adjusted American counter-messaging accordingly. The photograph was never static. It was a living battlefield, continually reinterpreted to serve evolving political needs. In 1985, during Gorbachev's glasnost period, Soviet journalists began investigating the Reichstag photograph's history, publishing articles that questioned the official narrative without fully dismantling it. Some mentioned Ismailov's erasure, others noted the retouching of looted watches and added smoke. These revelations were framed as evidence of Stalinist excess, not as indictments of Soviet propaganda itself. The message was, we were lied to then, but we are truthful now. The photograph remained a symbol of victory. Only the story of its creation was revised. American intelligence agencies observed this glasnost-era revisionism with interest. CIA assessments from 1987, partially declassified in 2015, concluded that Soviet self-criticism about wartime propaganda could be exploited to reinforce narratives of systemic dishonesty, but warned against overplaying the angle as it risked making American Cold War fabrications more visible by comparison. The memo's author noted, "Our own use of the Reichstag image in the 1940s and 50s does not withstand scrutiny. Recommend limiting public discussion to Soviet manipulations only." The photograph's afterlife in post-Cold War Russia is equally instructive. In the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and archives opened, Russian historians and journalists produced detailed investigations into the Reichstag banner-raising, identifying all participants, documenting the staging, and interviewing survivors like Ismailov. These accounts were published in academic journals and popular magazines, widely read but not widely integrated into official commemorations. The state continued to emphasize Kantaria and Yegorov, not because the truth was unknown, but because the myth was more useful. In the United States, the Reichstag photograph appears in Cold War museums and history textbooks primarily as an example of Soviet propaganda, with little mention of American counter-propaganda. The narrative remains. They lied. We exposed them. The CIA's fabrications are footnotes, if mentioned at all, buried in declassified documents that few outside academic circles read. The photograph's American life is simpler, cleaner, less contradictory than its Soviet one. What both narratives obscure is the human cost of being turned into a symbol. Ismailov spent 65 years knowing he had been erased, his contribution denied, his identity inconvenient. Kantaria and Yegorov lived under the pressure of being official heroes, their lives curated and controlled, their stories told by others. The fictional soldiers invented by American propagandists never existed, but their imagined fates, execution, betrayal, erasure, mirrored real Soviet practices closely enough to be believed, which meant real people suffered real consequences when the leaflets were discovered and investigations launched. The operational mechanics of symbolic warfare are not abstract. They involve photographers climbing through rubble, censors retouching images in dark rooms, intelligence officers drafting false narratives, couriers smuggling leaflets across borders, interrogators questioning suspects, families losing contact with arrested relatives. Every layer of manipulation has a human substrate, people whose lives are bent to serve the image's political function. The Reichstag photograph's trajectory from documentary moment to propaganda weapon to historical artifact reveals the Cold War's epistemological architecture. Both superpowers operated on the premise that reality was too important to be left unmanaged, that images required curation, that truth was a tactical consideration rather than an ethical one. The photograph was never allowed to be simply what it was, a record of soldiers performing a symbolic act in a destroyed city. It had to mean something larger, serve something greater, justify something beyond itself. In the end, the photograph's most enduring legacy is not the story it tells about the fall of Berlin or the triumph over fascism, but the story it tells about the nature of Cold War competition. The battle over the Reichstag image was a microcosm of the larger conflict. Two systems, each claiming moral superiority, each willing to lie to prove it, each using the same tools while condemning the other for using them. The soldier who became the symbol of American propaganda was never a real defector or a genuine convert. He was a composite, a projection, a narrative device constructed from fragments of truth and whole-cloth invention. He existed in leaflets and intelligence reports, not in life. But his symbolic power was real because the audience, Soviet citizens, Eastern European populations, Western observers, understood that the photograph had been manipulated, and that understanding, regardless of which manipulation they believed, eroded trust in official narratives on both sides. This erosion was the operation's true success, not belief in the specific fabrications, but the cultivation of doubt. If the Reichstag photograph could be staged, retouched, and lied about, what else was false? If heroes could be erased or invented, what was real? The Americans didn't need to convince Soviet citizens that their government was uniquely dishonest. They only needed to demonstrate that dishonesty was systemic, that the photograph itself was proof. The Soviets, for their part, used American propaganda efforts as evidence of Western moral bankruptcy, proof that capitalism's defenders were willing to lie as readily as they accused communists of lying. The photograph became a mirror, each side seeing in it confirmation of the other's duplicity while remaining blind to their own. Abdul Hakim Ismailov's rediscovery in 1996 disrupted neither narrative significantly. Russian media covered the story, but it didn't reshape Victory Day commemorations or force a reckoning with Soviet-era erasures. Western media reported it as a curiosity, another example of Soviet manipulation, without reflecting on the American fabrications that had exploited that manipulation. Ismailov himself gave interviews expressing no bitterness, only a quiet insistence that he had been there, that he had climbed the Reichstag, that his contribution mattered. He died 14 years later, his erasure partially reversed, but never fully remedied. The question that remains, beyond the operational details and the propaganda mechanics, is what the Reichstag photograph's Cold War life reveals about the limits of symbolic warfare. Both sides invested enormous resources in controlling the image's meaning, yet neither fully succeeded. The photograph remained contested, its narrative unstable, its truth perpetually deferred. The soldier in the frame was simultaneously a Soviet hero, an American propaganda tool, an erased Muslim, a fictional Ukrainian, a real Georgian, and a symbol of everything and nothing. This instability is the photograph's final lesson. Symbols are powerful, but they are not controllable. Once an image enters circulation, it escapes its creators, accumulates meanings, becomes a site of contestation. The Reichstag photograph was meant to be a straightforward victory image, but it became a battlefield, a forgery, a case study, a memorial, a lie, and a truth, all at once. The Cold War powers that fought over it could manipulate it, but they could not master it. The mechanics of that manipulation are now historical record. The retouching, the erasures, the fabrications, the leaflets, the arrests, the denials, all documented in archives, memoirs, and declassified files. What remains less clear is the cumulative effect of such operations on the populations they targeted. Did Soviet citizens who saw the American leaflets believe them? Did they dismiss them as obvious forgeries? Did the doubt they sowed outlast the specific claims? Did the erosion of trust in official narratives contribute to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse? Or was it a marginal factor in a much larger systemic failure? CIA assessments from the 1980s suggest ambivalence. Some analysts argued that decades of psychological warfare had created a Soviet population deeply cynical about official propaganda, making them more receptive to Western ideas. Others countered that the same cynicism made them distrustful of all narratives, Western or Soviet, rendering them politically disengaged rather than pro-Western. The Reichstag photograph, in this view, was one thread in a vast tapestry of competing manipulations, its individual impact impossible to isolate. What is certain is that the photograph's Cold War trajectory exemplifies the period's defining characteristic: the weaponization of information. Every image, every document, every narrative was potential ammunition. The line between truth and propaganda was not erased, but strategically blurred, with both sides claiming to defend truth while practicing deception. The Reichstag photograph was never about the soldiers who climbed the Reichstag. It was about the systems that used them, erased them, invented them, and forgot them. Meleton Kantaria, Mikhail Yegorov, and Abdul Hakim Ismailov were real men who performed a real act in a real place. But the photograph that documented that act was never allowed to be real. It was immediately conscripted into ideological service, retouched, reinterpreted, and weaponized. The soldiers became symbols, and symbols have no agency, no voice, no power to resist their own transformation. The American propagandists who fabricated stories about the photograph understood this. They didn't need to know the soldiers' real names or histories. They only needed the image's iconic status and the knowledge that it had been manipulated. The rest was narrative construction, targeted messaging, and distribution logistics. The operation's success was measured not by truth, but by penetration. How many leaflets distributed? How many arrests triggered? How much doubt sown? The Soviet censors who erased Ismailov operated under the same logic. His presence in the photograph was inconvenient, so it was removed. The decision required no malice, only bureaucratic efficiency. The photograph's function was to symbolize Soviet victory in terms that reinforced state ideology. Ismailov's Muslim identity complicated that symbolism, so he was excised. The retouchers who airbrushed him out were not villains. They were technicians, doing their jobs within a system that valued narrative control above documentary accuracy. This is the Cold War's epistemological legacy: the normalization of manipulation, the professionalization of deception, the transformation of truth into a tactical resource. The Reichstag photograph was one image among millions subjected to this process, but its iconic status makes it exemplary. If even the most celebrated photograph of the war's end was staged, retouched, and lied about, what image could be trusted? The answer from both Cold War powers was none and all. Trust the images that serve your side's narrative. Doubt the images that serve the enemy's. The photograph's truth value was always conditional, always political. This conditionality extended beyond images to all information, creating a hall of mirrors where every claim was suspect and every suspicion was justified. In the decades since the Cold War's end, the Reichstag photograph has been re-examined, recontextualized, and reinterpreted by historians, journalists, and artists. The manipulations are now well documented, the erasures acknowledged, the fabrications exposed. Yet the photograph retains its power, not despite its fraudulence, but because of it. It has become a symbol of symbolic warfare itself, a reminder that images are never neutral, that history is always curated, that the camera lies as fluently as the pen. The soldier who became the symbol of American propaganda was not a defector or a martyr. He was a narrative construct, built from the raw material of Soviet manipulation and shaped by American strategic needs. He existed in the space between truth and lie, in the contested territory where Cold War powers fought for control of meaning. His story is not about individual agency or heroism. It is about the machinery of propaganda and the human cost of being processed by it. Abdul Hakim Ismailov climbed the Reichstag on April 30th, 1945, and helped plant the Soviet flag. That is the truth. He was then erased from the photograph and the historical record for 65 years. That is also the truth. American intelligence fabricated stories about fictional soldiers to exploit that erasure. That is the truth. The photograph became a weapon in a war over reality itself. That is the truth. And none of these truths were allowed to coexist in official narratives until the systems that produced them collapsed. What remains is the image: a soldier, a flag, a ruined building, smoke rising over Berlin. The rest is contested, layered, manipulated, and true.